Okay, welcome to the video, everyone. I'm going to be going over more or less the ideas and concepts that unlocked this perspective within me. This is going to be a relatively long video because I will be pausing it to add additional context from my perspective. And I think Iain Mcgilchrist really is somebody who's like trying to figure out the truth. And I see him seeing both perspectives, which is how we find the truth. Like, we can't just get rid of one of our hemispheres without losing something. Like, if we just get rid of one of our perspectives of the way the world works, then we truly lose our understanding of the totality of it. So we need both in order to properly ground us in reality, but also understand our meaning and relationship to everything. And he's going to be going over a lot of this in this video. And I might be simplifying some of what he's going to say, but I do believe that I understand it relatively well. All right, let's continue.
First of all, I want to thank the Master and Fellows of Darwin College for the honor of asking me to give this lecture. Carved into the stone of the ancient temple of Apollo at Delphi was the injunction to know thyself. Without such knowledge, we are tossed this way and that by forces we neither suspect nor understand. Knowing ourselves helps explain our predicament, and doing so is greatly aided by understanding an aspect of the way in which the brain constructs the world. I believe we've adopted a limited vision of a very particular type. And precisely because it is limited, we cannot see that it is limited. We no longer seem to recognize what it is we do not know, what our way of being in the world is pushing out of our lives and out of our world. To understand what is going on, we need a breadth of view that is increasingly rare. It is the possibility of this that I intend to explore here today. Let me ask you this. Do you think there is a connection between realism, the appreciation of uniqueness, a capacity for understanding melody and harmony, an aptitude for appreciating time, a sense of humor, the ability to read body language, to sustain attention and the fight or flight mode? Or, on the other hand, between a talent for manipulation, a givenness to literalism, to theory at the expense of experience, unreasonable optimism, and a preoccupation with detail, as well as a loss of a sense of the living body, with, in its place, a focus on body parts?
So you saw him elaborate. Basically, the first thing he was talking about was the right hemisphere. The second thing he was talking about was the left hemisphere. So the left hemisphere, like he was saying, it divides things into parts. It tries to rationalize or re-represent reality to fit our needs or the utility we need it to prescribe to us to maintain either our survival or the survival of our kin. So it does a very good job at simplifying the world for the sake of our utility, while the other hemisphere tries to see the relationship between things. It tries to create larger wholes out of reality, and it tries to show us how we are related to everything else around us. So that's more or less what he's trying to go over here, and trying to get get these ideas going without pushing you too hard into believing that they're the case. He's more or less getting you to ask that question before he tries to address it.
Perhaps not. Yet I assure you there is such a connection in either case. It is rooted deep in us, and it is quite coherent once one comes to understand what underlies the pattern. My reason for starting here is to introduce the body of work generated over 3 decades and published in 2 long books. The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, in 2009, and The Matter with Things, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World, in 2021. In these books, I examine critically and in depth the matter of hemisphere difference and its important meaning for our lives. As you can see from the deliberately random selection of respectively right and left hemisphere tendencies above, the distinction is not the simple one that many might have heard and which should be unceremoniously buried. It's not at all the case that the left hemisphere is unemotional and dependable, whereas the right hemisphere is flighty and fanciful. If anything, the contrary is the case. But that the question has been wrongly answered, doesn't it?
This is somewhere where I'm kind of confused about, because I feel like there's emotions tied to each hemisphere and he goes over them, but there is a lot of emotion in the right hemisphere. It's just one of connection and one of love. So, and then the left hemisphere is one of anger, one of trying to divide things and break them apart. So you do need both, because if like an outside force is trying to attack us, like an animal or something, you want something that's not going to try to connect with it. You're going to want something that's trying to break it apart to make it not exist anymore and get rid of it, get rid of that problem. And that's what the left hemisphere does. It breaks things apart. So yeah, you have that anger side, and then you have that love side. And like that's an oversimplification. There's more emotions involved in each hemisphere, but I don't think the right hemisphere can get angry. I don't think it has anger built into its functionality, because it just sees the connection and tries to make things larger and larger wholes. But let's continue and see what else he says.
Invalidate the question, but rather should, in my opinion, invite further exploration. Consider these facts. The brain, an organ the power of which consists solely in making connections, is massively divided down the middle. Why? Moreover, it is asymmetrical in almost everything that can be measured at many levels in both its structure and function. Why? Not only that, but the band of fibers that connects the hemisphere at their base, the corpus callosum, is getting proportionally smaller, not larger, over evolution, and is, in any case, to a large extent, inhibitory in function. Again, why?
So again, what he's explaining there is that our brain over time has grown, but the corpus callosum has more or less stayed the same size. So if not, like it's slowly getting bigger while our brain is getting bigger a lot faster. So that's the proportionality that he's talking to. It's not necessarily that it's been shrinking over time. It's just that it's been disproportionately growing the hemispheres over time through evolution, while our corpus callosum is barely growing, if not at all.
Could it be that two aspects of brain function are being kept apart? Unfortunately, I cannot spend time on the evidence here. For one thing, there is a great deal of it, and it requires to be examined at length. It is laid out for that purpose in the two long books I've mentioned. I'm going to go straight to a characterization of some of the core findings, so please forgive me if these are lacking in finesse. To some extent, that is inevitable for present purposes, as I'm sure you will understand. In a nutshell, each hemisphere has evolved for classical Darwinian reasons to pay a different kind of attention to the world. When I saw this, I have to admit that the full import of the distinction did not immediately dawn on me, because I'd been trained in the cognitive science paradigm that saw attention as simply another cognitive function. But the nature of the attention we pay is of critical importance. It creates and molds the only world we can know. Indeed, it is a matter of a disposing of our consciousness towards the world in a particular way. The left hemisphere has evolved to pay narrow beam attention, focused on a detail that we already know and desire, and are intent on grabbing and getting, whether it be something to eat or to use in some other way. In a word, the left hemisphere exists in the service of manipulation. The right hemisphere, meanwhile, is on the...
So you see, he went over some there are very basic patterns in this left hemisphere. So one of manipulation. Well, what does that mean? Not only does it mean that you're manipulating words, and you can manipulate beings, and you can manipulate objects. Like, this is the hemisphere that manipulates things. And in the end, that can be seen as a positive and a negative. So it's depending on how you use it, what your perspective of the world is, what things you think you should be able to manipulate or should manipulate in order to get what you want. And if you believe that manipulating beings will get you what you want, you will soon find out that is not how the world works and not how it operates. So in elaborating this pattern further into every aspect of humanity, you see the connection there. It's like the left hemisphere is the one that is both it's a successful thing when it's oriented properly. And that's the problem, is that if it's not oriented properly, it'll be used, abused, and manipulated. It causes problems in people's lives. And what was the other thing he said? It's I think he said simplicity. So it creates simplistic understanding of the world to help you in order to manipulate what's going on. Because if you're paying attention to a whole tree instead of just the part that you're trying to get at, which is the fruit, then you're not gonna see the fruit. You're just gonna see the tree the whole time, which is what your right hemisphere is doing. It's like, I see the tree, and it's your relationship to it. It provides you shade, it provides you food, it provides you these things, but I'm not really able to see the fruit. Whereas your left hemisphere sees the fruit, and it's and you're able to go grab it. And obviously there's a little bit of pattern recognizing with your right hemisphere of what that thing is in relationship to you when you see the banana, but that's more or less what's happening. Your left hemisphere simplifies it, it sees, and then your right hemisphere also sees the meaning of it. So it's like, I see the banana, it means I'm going to keep living. The left hemisphere is like, I desire that banana so I can keep living.
Look out for everything else that's going on while we're manipulating, for mates, conspecifics, offspring, and predators.
So he just went over the right hemisphere and how it's constantly aware of our surroundings. So it's ever vigilant and lives in the present moment in that way. Because obviously you can't pay attention to, well, you can abstract. That's what eventually we evolved with the right hemisphere, is that there's an abstract thing that you should pay attention to in the bushes, and that's the predator. And I mean, it is true that we can do that with our right hemisphere. So we can basically take these abstract notions and project them into the future or into imagination to see whether or not they can happen. All right.
So as not to be eaten while eating. Its attention is broad, sustained, coherent, vigilant, and uncommitted as to what it may find.
So you see, it's uncommitted. So this is why he's going to go over this eventually, but it can think in both and. So it doesn't hold anything to be self-evident or obvious or absolute, like a true or false statement or yes and no. All these things that have to do with absolutes. And this is what religious individuals were arguing against, like Aristotle and some of the people that they were so against their way of thinking because they thought in absolutes. And then, but every religious individual all the way through history through that time was like saying like, no, once you think in absolutes, it destroys society, it destroys civilization. It's a very real problem that they were trying to solve. But in unlocking both perspectives together, that's what we're figuring out is the actual solution. So you need both science and religion, both logic and philosophy. You need all of these things together to properly orient ourselves in reality. And if one gets out of hand, they each have their own issue. And I've explained this in other videos, but your right hemisphere can connect things that aren't necessarily connected to each other. So it makes the connections. And the problem is that it'll connect things that aren't connected and make holes out of things that aren't holes. It, like if I try to combine my phone and my car, there's no hole there necessarily that will provide me with any utility, but it does provide me with meaning. So it's like my car allows me to drive me to work while my phone allows me to call my parents or whatever it may be. And then obviously there's deeper meanings rooted in each one of those things. But that's what your right hemisphere does. It keeps drawing these connections between things. But it does, like if you said you wanted to call your parents, you wouldn't connect to like the thought of your phone or your car. Because your car, I mean, maybe your car has a phone in it, but your car's has a different utility, and that's what your left hemisphere is for. It like tells you like your car's utility is to drive, your phone's utility is to call. So we need to, the connection mean that each brain is like trying to draw is the connection of A, what is its utility and what is its meaning. So the meaning is what I'm looking for, but so is the utility. So you need both. And that's what eventually some of the conclusions of what he finds is.
Exact opposite of that of the left hemisphere. In brief, the right hemisphere is in the service of understanding the contextual whole, which is nothing less than the world. And context changes everything. The difference then is not, as used to be supposed, to do with what each hemisphere does, as though it were some sort of a machine, so much as the manner in which it does it, as though it were part of a person. The hemispheric difference in attention is beyond dispute. Indeed, it is universally attested. And since the nature of attention also indisputably changes what it is that comes to our attention, such a difference logically cannot but lead to two different phenomenological worlds. Hence my belief that attention is a moral act. It helps form both us and the world we come to know.
So he's more or less saying not only what you pay attention to is what's going to define how we act and what we do as a civilization or as individuals, but also which perspective you're enamored by, or like which one you're utilizing for the sake of interpreting the world. And to be one or whole with your own self is to make sure that you're paying attention to both. So if, let's say that you're going out to eat some kind of food, well, how should you make a decision about what to eat? Well, you do have to take into consideration your health, but also you have to take into consideration like whether or not the food, you're going to find that food disgusting or not. And then like all the other things that you have to figure out. So that's, the right hemisphere. You're trying to connect all the dots. But then the left hemisphere is like, I just don't like this kind of food, or it does like this kind of food. So the left hemisphere is more or less going to tell you whether or not it's good or bad tasting, and whether it enjoys it. And that's slightly different than disgust, because you can simply just eat something that you don't like without necessarily being disgusted by it. But the right hemisphere is more of disgust, and it sees this like, this is disgusting. It's like your left brain won't care if it drinks old, as long as it tastes good. It doesn't care if it drinks old, spoiled stuff, but your right hemisphere will see like, this has been aging for a long time. I'm not going to eat it. So, yeah.
So what are these two worlds like? Very briefly, if crudely, these worlds could be characterized like this. In the case of the left hemisphere, the world is simplified in the service of manipulation. It is made of isolated, static things. Things, moreover, that are already known, familiar, predetermined, and fixed. They're fragments that are importantly devoid of context, disembodied, and meaningless, abstract, generic, quantified.
So you see, he's saying a lot of things that just go over how our left hemisphere doesn't actually care about the way the world actually works, which I'm saying actually a lot, but it doesn't care about the way the world works. It'll try to re-represent reality, and he's going to go over that in a minute. But it doesn't matter how the external world or how the world actually works. What matters is the utility of whether or not it provides us with an action that leads to the goal we're pursuing. So that's why your attention matters more than anything else. It's like, what are you paying attention to in reality? If it's things like race or other immutable characteristics, you're on the wrong path, because those things inherently are going to lead you to a wrong understanding of what reality is and give you the wrong pursuit, the wrong goals, and it will lead to nothing but destruction, chaos, and the separation of things through entropy. And while we do need that perspective of the syntheses that are like our society, so we are humans, we are a synthesis, but we all have a bunch of different characteristics in between us, which are immutable, and those are of the natural order and natural world. So we can't ignore any of them, and they all have their say, but at the same time, what we're pursuing is a stable society, not the ultimately stable, because obviously that'd be extreme, but we're trying to pursue a homeostasis between these things. And people that aren't in pursuit of it it's going to manifest and show itself, and it's going to be obvious. Like, hey, you are obviously not in the pursuit of bringing things together and cooperating and creating a balance and creating a place where everyone would want to be. And if you're not in that pursuit, then the only other thing you can be in pursuit of is destruction, dividing things apart, or taking and everything becoming yours. And that's very egotistical, which is left of the left hemisphere. It's oversimplification, which is of the left hemisphere. It's breaking things apart into smaller parts, which is of the left hemisphere. And it's all about you, me, or me, rather than an idea that we should all be working together cooperatively, not just for our own sake, but for the sake of the collective as well. And that's the difference between the left and right hemisphere. So from the left hemisphere, there is a way or a path you can rationalize that it's better for yourself. It's better for me and my ego to better other people's lives. But through your right hemisphere perspective, it's like, here's this hole that we need to make sure we take care of. So as long as you have your left hemisphere under control and have it logically deduce and like conclude, I guess deduction might be of the right hemisphere, but it comes to a conclusion about how your ego can be served better by making sure other people are taken care of. That's how we know we have a good handle on our left hemisphere. But at the same time, we need to make sure we pay attention to our right hemisphere perspective, which is also going to be at odds with our left hemisphere perspective often. So in our right hemisphere sees the connection, it sees the relationship, it sees the love and the synthesis and the coming together of things.
Fungible, mechanical, ultimately bloodless and lifeless. This is indeed not so much a world as a representation of a world, which means a world that's actually no longer present, but reconstructed after the fact. And it is literally two-dimensional, schematic, and theoretical. Not, in fact, a world at all, more like a map. Nothing wrong with a map, of course, unless you mistake it for the world. And here, the future is a fantasy that remains under our control. The left hemisphere is unreasonably optimistic and fails to see the dangers that loom. In the case of the right hemisphere, by contrast, there is a world of flowing processes.
I'm sorry to interrupt again, but that was a very important point, is that the left hemisphere doesn't care about predators. It doesn't care about the underlying problems that will arise from some of our decisions. So one example is gene editing. If you're only left hemispheric, you're just going to see nothing but the utility of how gene editing is going to help our society and progress it. You say progress, right? But we need to fully understand it. And the right hemisphere sees this. It's like there's a very real danger in changing germline edited DNA, because how much are you taking into account? So we don't know which genes are responsible for maintaining balance and harmony of life. So if there's some switch that we hit where cells no longer care about how much they consume, they will just consume everything. Like DNA, we can edit DNA of cells to replicate infinitely and just absorb everything as fast as they can. But we intuitively, like our DNA and the DNA of all life already has encoded in it some kind of stopgap, something that prevents us from an individual life form consuming everything. And we're approaching that because of our ability to abstract. We're no longer beholden to our DNA, which is the thought, the idea that good and evil are no longer, or are things that we understand and can intuit and maintain in the world. We're no longer just following our intuitions. We also can abstract the world out and manipulate it. And in doing so, we ignore the other aspects that could be at stake. Like, what is another example? Green energy, right? A lot of the arguments from the right, like I do think that there's things that we're doing to the environment that we can better. But the right the right goes extreme and the left goes extreme in this way, and they extremely say the whole world's going to end if we don't do this, and then the other side says the whole world's going to end if we do this. And it's like, well, those are the extreme cases, right? So there's a true dichotomy here between how, like, the extreme case, which is unrealistic, of the world ending if we move too fast to or green energy, and then there's this other extreme that can never happen of all life being wiped out if we continue to use fossil fuels. Fossil fuels will be with us forever. We'll always use them for some purpose, but like it's due to the amount. It's just like horses. We no longer use horses for any real practical purpose. It's all just either entertainment, which I guess you can argue is practical, but they're always going to be with us and in some shape or form. And the thing about these extremes is that they don't try to come back together, which is where the true answer is between these two extremes. We don't know exactly where it is, and that's the search we need to find. But we need to do it by aiming together at the truth rather than trying to divide the two perspectives. And so if we take, for me, like just for this example, when it comes to green energy, I truly believe that that's where we're heading and where we would need to head at some point in the future, because fossil fuels are not sustainable. Obviously, there's a possibility we could develop something that could continue to synthesize oils, but I don't think we could do it to the degree that we would need, especially in the time we would need it in. So I do think that we'll be able to do that, but it'll be like a trickle effect. It won't really necessarily be enough to sustain society, especially how much energy we need to consume as we grow larger and larger and incorporate more and more energy, but we're also becoming more efficient at the same time. So there's kind of a difference there, like between how efficient we're becoming. Like light bulbs have gotten so much more efficient. Like, so we're improving technology, which is allowing us to use less energy to do particular things. But the point is that I don't think the world is going to end if we don't push extremely hard towards green energy. And I don't think the world is going to, I don't think the extreme case where people are completely nuts and schizoid if they believe that we're affecting the climate, because it's happened in the past. Like the Permian extinction was where like, what was it? The algae basically completely filled the air with oxygen, and it caused a mass extinction because now they can't breathe. So then they all just died off. So that's another thing life had to take into account. And it only happened once, but now we have the opposite effect where animals, or us, are now creating too much CO2 in the air. And now we're creating our own mass extinction. And I don't know how far this extinction event will go, but it seems like there's going to be a lot of life that ends up dying as a result. And obviously we have microplastics and all the other problems, but these are problems that I think are solvable. We just need to stop making we do need to make the extreme case, but we need to stop trying to head towards it as what we think is the answer. So the balance of the two would be, we should progress towards green energy, but let it happen at a natural pace and believe and trust in the process. And you could say God, because he and us are going to make it through this. Whether you believe in God or not, like, we will make it through this. And then there is, what would it be? The other case is like trying to slow everything down, and that's okay. Like, we do need to make sure we don't take it too fast, and we don't like get rid of everything else. Like, it's not like there's nothing we need to consider when it comes to how hard we push for this. And we do need to take into consideration that there's poor people on the planet that won't be able to afford to transition yet because it's not ready for the consumer market. And in subsidizing it, we'll pull forward a lot of demand, but that money could have been put to use to make sure people had infrastructure or some other thing that saved lives. So people are dying in other ways by transferring this money from one project to another. So, and then there's the whole idea of misallocation of resources where it's like, okay, well, what if you're choosing the wrong technology that's not actually going to be the one that succeeds? But now we more or less know which one's going to succeed. But I do not believe that incentivizing particular things is going to be beneficial. I think all it has are consequences involved because of misallocation of resources and because, just so many other problems that come along with it. But I'm kind of digressing. But the point is that you have these two extremes. We should try to meet in the middle and try to find a solution from both perspectives. And that's the left hemisphere science, right hemisphere religion. And you could see it play out. It's like they're obviously coming to these two different conclusions for a reason. Well, what makes people religious? Why do they think religiously? Like why? It's like scientific people, but scientific or religious people understand how scientific people think, but scientific people can't understand how religious people think because they're seeing the connection, they're seeing the relationship, they're seeing this other perspective that you don't see, and that's what Iain is trying to get at.
It's not isolated things. One where nothing is simply fixed, entirely certain, exhaustively known, or fully predictable, but always changing and ultimately interconnected with everything else. Where context is everything, where what exists are wholes, of which what we call the parts are an artifact of our way of attending, where what really matters is implicit, a world of uniqueness, one where quality is more important than quantity, a world that is essentially animate. Here the future is a product of realism, not denial. This is a world that is fully present, rich and complex, a world of experience which calls for understanding, not the map at all, but a world that is mapped. The emotional timbre here is more cautious and in general more realistic. We need both of these worlds to work together, but also independently, hence the need for connection and separation. Naturally, we are not aware of this because these worlds are combined at a level below our awareness. We become aware only after an accident of nature, such as a stroke, tumor, or injury, or after commissurotomy, the so-called split brain operation, or if one hemisphere at a time is experimentally suppressed. Then they may become suddenly, vividly present to us. Yet because these two worlds have mutually incompatible properties, when we come to reflect self-consciously and to rationalize about what we find, we're forced by the requirement for consistency to choose between the pictures of the world they offer. This is why, as Iain Whitehead, one of my intellectual heroes, observed, a culture is in its finest flower before it begins to analyze itself. Once our lives become very largely mediated by self-reflexive language and discourse, as in our postmodern world they are, the explicit stands forward and the implicit retires. Yet almost everything that really matters to us, the beauty of nature, poetry, music, art, narrative, drama, myth, ritual, sex, love, the sense of the sacred, must remain implicit if we're not to destroy their nature. The attempt to make the implicit explicit radically alters its nature. We can no longer rely on the wisdom that comes from these all-important but hidden sources, from closeness to the long tradition of a society, to nature and to the sacred, to sophisticate our understanding. In fact, we see these not as irreplaceable guides to truths deeper than those that science can encompass, but as lies. Possibly entertaining lies, but lies nonetheless. We begin to see only the self-created, self-referring world according to the left hemisphere. We go for the machine model, reductive materialism, and the consequences are all around us.
So again, I do think this process was the result of the Enlightenment. Like when that happened and people looked at the world through a rationalist, utilitarian perspective, our entire world exploded with innovation, with productivity, with utility, and it's generated so much good for us. But all of it was in service to our right hemisphere and God and each other. And we took everything into account still. And that's, I mean, obviously we didn't with oil. Like oil was more or less one of the biggest, I think, and coal and all these other things. They were huge things that we didn't see. Like there were a predator in the water we didn't quite recognize yet. But now we see it as a predator. We know it's something that will lead to the destruction of civilization if we don't. Obviously, that's an exaggeration, but it'll lead to a worse world where it's harder for us to survive, and we will be paying the price for that. But just like we're paying the price for our debt, but that's beside the point. It's like we were unable to see the sharks that were waiting in the water for us with these technologies. And because of it, we're paying the price now. And I argue that we should make sure that any technology in the future, like the AI, all these other things, we're at least thinking about the possibilities of what the worst case scenario could be with them. And I think we are doing that somewhat, but people need to take it very seriously, especially if you're of the left hemisphere and you don't see any issues, you don't see any problems. I would definitely talk to somebody who does see the problems and try to get them to help you point it out and take them seriously. Because I know it's hard to be like, oh yeah, you think the Earth is 6,000 years old, your perspective is complete bogus. Well, it's like, it's really upsetting that people who are religious have to fixate on the material aspects of a Bible. Like the Bible is the word, it's a translated word that people interpreted from their right hemisphere into the book to establish meaning, establish purpose, and establish your people's orientations in the world. And it's very good at articulating how our right hemisphere sees the world. But it does a very poor job of understanding science, utility, logic, reason, all these things that are not of the right hemisphere. So, and it does it through narrative, which is how we establish relationships. It's why women talk so much to each other. They are more being religious when they're telling stories to each other. And that's how religions started, is that women were gossiping. They're like, hey, here's all these patterns we should pay attention to. Like, what do you think of these? But also men were more ingrained in the right hemisphere as well, because they had so much deeper connection to everyone. And we're losing that with all the advent of these technologies. We're seeing the technologies and we're confusing them for life. So we see them as the meaning of our lives is to develop these technologies, rather than the other way around, is that these technologies are in service to life and the meaning and relationships we have to other people. So that's more or less what Ian's trying to get at, is that the left hemisphere just sees these specifics and it's either or, and it's arrogant, and it's where your ego lives. Or at least it's an advocate for the id. So the id is your basic instincts, and that's at the base of your spine. Well, who advocates for that, and like which one tries to find out a way to satisfy the id? Well, that's your left hemisphere, and that's why for me it's the id advocate. So your left hemisphere is the advocate for your id. The corpus callosum is the ego, or the transmitter of the information and the inhibitor, and then your right hemisphere is the superego, which is the one that tries to inhibit you. And a lot of people sort of say it's the connection to God, and you could say that it's the one that can perceive of the entity or the framework or however you want to view it. The thing that people refer to as God is perceived through the right hemisphere and the connection to everything, and creating larger and larger wholes out of everything.
Unfortunately, the two hemispheres are not equally veridical. In terms of our ability to apprehend, take hold of and use the world, the left hemisphere is superior. But in terms of the ability to comprehend the world, the right hemisphere is superior. In each of what one might call the portals of understanding, attention, perception, judgment, emotional and social intelligence, cognitive intelligence, that is IQ, and creativity, the right hemisphere is so much superior that the left hemisphere on its own has been repeatedly described as frankly delusional. This is not a rhetorical expression. Denial of the facts and delusional beliefs are far commoner in association with damage to the right hemisphere, and consequently dependence on the left hemisphere, than the reverse.
So again, I'm not sure if he goes over this in this video, but he establishes that that's the reason why, like, children with autism or individuals with schizophrenia have these issues. It's not because, like, they do have, there is the problems with the right hemisphere as well, don't get me wrong, but it's usually in the case that they're drawing false connections between things that there's no connection to, whereas the left hemisphere is the one that's actually delusional. It's coming up with, it's trying to answer things, it's trying to rationalize why that's the case. It's like, why did I draw this connection? And then it tries to say that this is the reason why I drew this connection, and often it's not. There's no reason. Often, sometimes you just make false connections, and your right hemisphere self-corrects it and is okay with being wrong. And that's why it thinks both ways. It's like, I think both of these, and then your left hemisphere just takes one of them and runs with it. So that's why when you get upset, when you get angry, when you do draw false connections and try to rationalize it, that's why. It's because your left hemisphere, your ego, or your advocate for the ego, or the advocate for the id, sorry. But I think of ego differently. I think his ego is just your idea and concept of yourself. Like when people are saying you're egotistical, you're saying, like, I am oriented towards myself and nothing else. And you try to separate yourself into smaller parts too.
On its own, the left hemisphere confabulates, makes up stories so to fit with its beliefs. It will frankly insist that a paralyzed limb is unaffected, or if challenged, deny that the offending appendage belongs to the subject at all. Belongs to you, doctor. Unlike the right hemisphere, which sees more than one angle and has for this reason been called by V.S. Ramachandran the devil's advocate, the left hemisphere never doubts that it is right. It is never wrong and never at fault. Someone else is always to blame. Furthermore, in what I take to be the four important onward paths to truth, science...
You see, this is why I advocate. This is what people were trying to elaborate on with the concept of Lucifer and God. They were literally trying to show you that there's these two perspectives of the world. One is of God and one is of Lucifer. And obviously, it's not to say that you are God, like your right hemisphere is God or whatever, but it's how you perceive of these concepts in the world. And it's exactly right. It's like the left hemisphere, or left-leaning individuals, liberals, have this mannerism where they cannot be wrong, and they'll always try to find a new answer why they're right. But the people who are of the right hemisphere are perfectly okay with, or people who argue in the way the right hemisphere does, this is especially true of things they don't necessarily care about. You're okay with being wrong. But it's when you truly are questioned on your actual beliefs and things you believe to be true, that's when you know it's part of your ego, part of your simplification, because we do simplify the world. So that's why you need to, like, if we were to test these things, we would want to establish what are your actual beliefs in the world. And then if someone goes against them or like tries to question them, are you okay with that? And I actually have that as one of my questions in my survey. But regardless, it's definitely the case that this is true, and you would expect it to be the case, because in a free society where people who are allowed to have exchange of free ideas, like, you would expect there to manifest the biggest differences within people, like the biggest personality differences, sex differences, every difference that would be of humanity would manifest in our political system, as long as it's free from the bottom up. And that happened over time. Like, political parties merged, some of them went away, and they became the two. Well, why do we have two political parties? One is of the left hemisphere, one is of the right hemisphere. And there's two perspectives we have of the world. And it makes sense that it was the battle of the gods, more or less, over time, between different parties until we came up with the two nascent, most nascent ones, the ones that are most attributed to the differences between how humans think. And obviously we have libertarianism, which would just be the ignoring of both of them for the sake of the individual. And you could say that's of the left hemisphere, but it's also of the right hemisphere. It's more or less saying, hey, you guys are trying to push your perspectives too far. We need to ring it in a little bit. So that's how I view it. And let's continue.
Science, reason, intuition, and imagination, though both hemispheres contribute, the crucial part in each case, including in science and reason, is played by the right hemisphere, not the left. Our predicament is that we now live in a world where the understanding of which is largely limited to that of the inferior left hemisphere. Some signs of this include our inability to see the broader picture, both in space and in time, the way in which wisdom has been lost, understanding reduced to mere knowledge, and knowledge replaced by information, tokens, representations, the loss of the concepts of skill and judgment, which are the products of experience, the divorce of mind and matter, resulting in a strong tendency to simultaneous abstraction, and the debasement of matter to mere lumpen matter, therefore our exploitation. An exponential growth of bureaucracy and administration, everywhere the proceduralization of life, the reduction of justice to mere equality, a loss of the sense of the uniqueness of all things, the supplanting of quality by quantity, the abandonment of nuance in favor of simplistic either-or positions, the loss of reasonableness, which is replaced by rationalization, a complete disregard for common sense, the design of systems not for humans, but to maximize utility, a growth of paranoia and pervasive mistrust. For if all is not under its control, the left hemisphere becomes anxious and projects its anxiety outwards onto others. Nonetheless, we play the passive victim and abjure responsibility for our own lives. In addition, I might point to the rise of anger and aggression in the public sphere, the destruction of social cohesion and its replacement by angry warring factions. Like almost everything that used to be said about hemisphere differences, the idea that the left hemisphere is unemotional is wrong. The most highly lateralized emotion is anger, and guess what? It lateralizes to the left hemisphere. And there are more indications, but for today's purposes, I'll stop here.
Okay, so I'm going to stop the video here. And so yeah, he elaborated on the hemispheric differences and some of the connections that I've drawn go beyond what he said. And I don't think this is the perfect video to elicit these differences and just lay them flat out, each one by one, to draw the pattern out, because he's more or less trying to show you how it's manifested in people through politics. And like you could see it, what he's trying to get at is like, hey, here's all these people who are over rationalistic. They attempt to simplify the world in a way that is impossible. And they're going to find it out eventually, as long as they don't kill everybody along the way. But they're going to find out their rationalization and their attempt to interpret the world leads to nothing but bad and detrimental outcomes. It's like the concept of race. Race should not be a concept we utilize anymore. We know it to be scientifically false, and we know it to be morally wrong. So identifying people as immutable characteristics does nothing to tell you about who they are as a person and how you should interact with them. So it's useless when it comes to utility, and the meaning of it is to say, you are this thing. Like, this is who you are, is this color, this person, and it's black, or it's white, or it's whatever. Asian's a different category, but when it comes to racial immutable characteristics, it is unchangeable. So when you call someone Chinese, are you saying they're Chinese as in the shape of their eyes? Are you saying something racist? Or are you saying that they're Chinese because of their heritage and because of their nationality. And obviously that's region based. So Chinese from your heritage, your genetics came from this region. Or are you saying you're Chinese because your citizenry is of China? So these are all the distinctions we don't make. And it's very, I wouldn't say irritating, but it's very disingenuous to do so. And it's an oversimplification, because we do have individual differences, but we should not be judging based on immutable ones, because those are the ones that we cannot change about ourselves. It's like, well, if me being this color is all of a sudden wrong, there's nothing I can do about it. If me having this hair color, there's nothing I can do about it. Obviously, you could say I gotta dye my hair, but then I'm not being true to myself. I'm putting on a facade for the sake of who somebody else thinks I should be. And that's just wrong. So we should not be basing things on immutable characteristics. Only the things that we can change about ourselves should we be judging, because those are the things that we know we have under our control. Like, I should have my character under control. I should have my how I treat people under control. All these things are my choice. My choices are under my control. So that's how we should judge people, based on their character, their merit, what they've accomplished, the things they've done for society to help establish more syntheses and bring people together, not the people who tear stuff apart. And that's what the concept of race is. So I argue that we should just get rid of it altogether. But people are like, okay, well, how do you identify people who have been through trauma based on discrimination, etc.? Well, you can still say people were identifying them based on these racial characteristics and being discriminatory, but utilizing the category for anything other than identification is a terrible means, or a terrible way to identify people, or to group them or categorize them, other than the way to identify them. So the other thing is, so if you're using it for any other purpose other than identifying people, then I don't see another thing you can utilize it for that wouldn't be discriminatory, divisive, or some other thing. And an example of that is, well, there's black people with black skin who come from Africa. I migrate here. What's up, brother? One sec. They migrate here, if I can talk. And they migrate here, and they don't have a connection to slavery at all. So it's to say that, okay, well, if these people have no connection to slavery, if they've never been here during that time, they've never had discrimination from anybody, do we still consider them the same as somebody who's had not only discrimination themselves, who's had a history of their family having discrimination, and their ancestors were slaves? Those are three different things that can happen. So like, we've had, the civil rights movement. Somebody could have migrated to Africa during the civil rights movement, been treated like a typical individual who's of this nature during that time, and then become more discriminatory against the system. Or you could have a current person who has discrimination acted against them. So these are the categories of people that could exist, and we have to separate them into each category. Like, people who've actually, you yourself have experienced discrimination. Then we find out who did it, and we punish them. And then your ancestors have experienced discrimination. Well, we're very sorry for that, and we're trying to rectify that as a society to make sure we get rid of this concept of race. And like, we understand that you still have this heritage, which is what I think we should replace race with. You have this heritage of people who have experienced this in your family, and now we guess what? We fought an entire war over it as a society, and now we don't look at people that way, or we shouldn't, but we continue to do so. So it's like, do we want to get rid of racism or not? Because if we do want to, then we need to get rid of these terms. They're useless. They're outdated. They don't have a basis in science. Humans have a genetic similarity of 99.9% across all of us. So you're 99.9% wrong when you call somebody a black person. It's like, well, now you've reduced them to the color of their skin, when in reality they are so much more than that. And we need to stop that. So if you wanted to identify a particular culture, you could say American culture, and there's subsects of American culture. One is of this very specific nature of selfishness, greediness, etc., and the other is of this more cohesive spiritual whole and trying to help people. So it's like the culture aspect of it is very two distinct things. You're either engaging in these hedonistic, selfish, possession-seeking, flaunting of wealth, living in your advocate for the ego or advocate for the id, who's going to sit here and say like any attack on our position is an attack on us, and we need to get rid of that. Our solution is to shoot them and kill them. So anybody that calls us a name, calls us stupid, or calls us, whatever, brokey, we need to kill them. And that's your left hemisphere drawing that conclusion. That's the answer to get rid of this problem. So yeah, that's why I argue we need to get rid of the concept of race. It has no bearing on society. It's just a useless term. But I have an entire paper that I'm writing on it. If anybody's interested, I can post it. But so this is my video, my first reaction video, and I just wanted to introduce who Iain Mcgilchrist is, Dr. Iain Mcgilchrist is to everyone, because he's the one who started this for me. Like, I wouldn't say that. I've obviously been researching a lot of this on my own, and he's the reason I want to get into neuroscience now. Like, I was trying to be a clinical psychologist, but now I know for sure that neuroscience is where we will find the answers. And it'll be like, it might even be a new study between psychology and neuroscience that synthesizes the two. But, neuropsychology, I guess you would call it. But I think it will be based on dichotomology and be based on some of the hemispheric differences. So, wish me luck. All right. Thank you guys for watching. I love you all. And I hope you learned something, or at least go and research this stuff yourself, because I'm not just making up the hemispheric differences. This, like he said in the beginning, it's based on, 5,000 research papers, and many of them are meta-analyses. And he's made his basically own meta-analysis of all the hemispheric differences. And they're in these huge books. And I know not everybody has the time to go research them. So I've done a relatively good job of simplifying them and putting them in my book. So if anybody wants to read over that, they feel free, because it's always going to be in the description now. So you can always just access it whenever you want. But hope everybody enjoyed it, and I'm going to do reaction videos more often, especially on Sundays, I think. But here's the first one that I've done. Thank you guys for watching.